welcome to Commander Central, episode 302. Today, we are going to be taking a look at Wincons in EDH. I'm Dana.
And I'm Chris.
Hey, Chris, how's it going today?
Oh, it's going pretty good. You know, Max bailed on us again. He's got family things going on. I mean, who does Christmas in January? Gosh.
That's right. I think this was his January Christmas with his family, so he's out of town.
No, that's fine. I haven't talked to him in a while, so I was like bummed when I heard that he wasn't going to be on. I'm like, oh, that's a shame.
Yeah, I have not seen him as much as I usually do either. We're definitely going to take a road trip down to Chicago here in a couple of weeks, so that'll be nice. I can kind of catch back up with him.
Yeah, it's definitely hard with this time of year around us anyway.
Yeah.
You know, we look at like single digit temperatures for highs, and we're just like, yeah, we don't want to do anything.
I don't want to go outside right now. So yeah, we're still kind of in that lull in between things firing back up for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty 2, which has been kind of a welcome breather, but I'm also, I don't know, I'm kind of like ready to go again.
I am too. I was actually looking at something, what was it, like, you know, where they have the prerequisite for the set or something like that, like the weird name that they have coming out for it. And the one that comes out after, I think it's Brothers War or whatever the latest one is that they actually released what the name is, it's called kayaking. And I really want to know what that means. Like kayaking, like of all things, I'm like, what is going on? Are we going to go to like a water world or something? Is that what's going to happen here?
That would be pretty cool. I'd be down for that.
Yeah, that's because I saw that and I'm like, so many ideas. What is going on?
Man, we're already thinking 8 sets ahead at this point, basically.
Well, yeah, because, you know, that's the fun part is when, you know, you don't know exactly what it is. Like, you hear, like, for, like, the latest sets that are out, it's like, okay, I basically understand what's going to be in that set. And it's the ones that you don't know that you're always curious about.
Yeah, for sure. Going to a whole new planet with whole new things. Like, I'm looking forward to both Dominaria and Brothers War, because that's like old school stuff that really appeals to me. But it's also fun when they do a plane that you haven't been to before, and everything is kind of brand new.
Yeah, that's what I saw a real uptick in like player base when Ixalan and stuff like that came out, because, you know, dinosaurs and all that, and everyone was like, bet. Oh, that's awesome, and a lot of people jumped into the game right around then. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, we like, you know, I don't know if we complain a little bit jokingly about the absolute glut of product we get right now, but like, I don't know, it's just nice to have new toys too all the time. So like 6 of one, half dozen of the other, I guess. That is true. The only downside of having so much new product is like, I don't have room to fit any more of these new cards and decks.
I mean, it's getting really genuinely difficult for sure. I totally agree. Even if your deck isn't perfectly optimized or anything, there's just so much stuff. Like, you know, like I want to try this new toy out, and I haven't even drawn this card from 3 sets ago yet.
Yeah, it's called Soul Ring. Doesn't exist in the deck. I swear to God.
Just never ever see it. Yeah, no, I hear you. I actually played the game on stream this week that that 3 of the 4 players opened with the turn 1 Soul Ring.
That's not a good sign. I would have been like, we need to have a talk about the power level we're playing right now.
No kidding. And it still wound up, it was not a fast game. It still wound up dragging on like, you know, hour and 20 minutes or so.
At that point, you wish you had that black-green spell so you could just blow up everyone's Soul Ring and just be like, eat it.
Well, I was playing my Jeru deck, and at one point, I got to the very end, and I'm like, the game was clearly wrapping up, and I'm like, I need to make a move here. And I'm like, well, all right, I dropped Elspeth's Son's Champion. I had a mana doubler out, too, so I could make a ton of mana that turn. I dropped Elspeth's Son's Champion and Elspeth Tyrael, both who make 3 soldier abilities.
Oh, boy.
And then played a Catherine's Crusade and an Anointed Procession.
Wow.
So I made 12 soldiers, all of which had 12 counters on them. And I'm like, and I also had a Smothering Tithe out at the time, so I was making double treasure tokens then off anybody's draws. And I'm like, well, I guess I'm passing the turn. Let's see if anybody can find an answer, because there's nothing to really enable haste in that deck. I'm like, well, you guys got a turn, because if it comes back around to me, everyone's dying.
That's one of those things that's like an action movie where you're just sitting there, you do all that, and all of a sudden all the laser beams like get pointed at your chest, and you're like, uh-oh.
Red dots all over yourself. Yeah, that's basically what that was. Like, well, I'm either going to win or lose. We might as well have one of those 2 things occur and wrap this up. So
yeah, I do that a lot. I like forcing the subjects like, well, let's just do this right here, right now, and see what happens.
Yeah, there are times you want to hold back, but sometimes you're like, let's just do it. Let's get it done. So if you out there in listener land have any fun games you want to talk about, or want to just complain about how you don't get to see Max enough, how'd you go about doing that, Chris?
Well, you can find us on a multitude of social media platforms. You can find us on Twitter at CMDR Central. You can search us up on Facebook, CMDR Central. You can find us on YouTube by searching CMDR Central, and you can also find us online at cmdrcentral.com.
And this is the point in the show where Max would mention all the new patrons. And I know we had a couple this week, but Max isn't here. So next week we'll have a double list of new patron supporters. But thanks to all the supporters out there, and thanks to just our listeners in general, it does mean a lot. The support is a big deal. Keeps the lights on, keeps things running around here. Lets Raphael edit our show in the way we've kind of gotten used to. He does a fantastic job there. So thanks to everyone out there. It means a lot going into our 302nd episode here of the show.
Yeah, 300 episodes.
That's insane. That's crazy. Seriously, that's crazy. We probably don't have 300 more in us, but we've got quite a few left, I think.
Challenge accepted.
Been to episode 606.
Take some.
Maybe we'll get there.
Some Barney from How I Met Your Mother, and I'm just going to call you guys up and be like, suit up.
Yeah, let's do it. So today's show, we're going to talk about Wincons in EDH. And first thing I want to define, I guess, what that means, what we're talking about. In thinking about it, I kind of wound up mentally dividing win conditions in games into 3 different kind of loose categories. The first, I would call just a general game plan is your win condition. Max isn't here, but we'll talk about his Dracula Jamoka deck. It's a deck filled with like giant beaters that all have flying. So there's often a point in the game where he just has 4 creatures in play that each hit you for like 6 or 7 damage, and you can't deal with them because they all have flying. You just die. Like, you just kill somebody. So a portion of his deck's plan is built to getting to that point in the game. He has a bunch of ways to recur stuff. He has a bunch of protection spells like Deferious Protection and Heroic Intervention. And I think he has even some blink spells that blink things out, like Eerie Interlude. So he has multiple ways to get to that point in the game where he can just punch somebody in the face with these giant creatures that you can't stop. And that's kind of a win condition for him in that deck. He knows he can just oftentimes get there if he plays that deck long enough. He gains a bunch of life, so it's easier to survive to that point too. There's just a lot of things in that deck that work to make it so he can get to that point and actually just start killing people with combat damage.
Yep, and I do believe that combat damage is probably the number one way to win a game. And I was actually thinking hard about this going back to like the beginning of Magic. I remember when I was growing up, I used to read about it. I've watched like the old streams of watching like John Finkel and all them playing in the original Magic tournaments and everything. And that was always how like winning was. It wasn't all the other win cons that we're going to discuss here later. It was pretty much, you're just setting up, you're doing a little bit here, removing things, but you're always smacking in for combat damage for the win.
Yeah, Juzam Jin was a crazy card back then because it was a 5/5 for 4 mana.
Yep.
It didn't have trample, it didn't have any kind of evasion, but like there was just, that's how the game was played. If you can land that card and get it in on somebody, you were going to win games. I think Commander's changed a little bit in this regard. Maybe once upon a time, your Commander, your combat damage plan could just be, I've got a bunch of creatures and I might win. I think today, generally speaking, you have to have a little more of a plan than that. Like Max's, where they all have evasion. Yep. I think it'll be much trickier for him if he didn't have all those creatures that had flying, but he does. They're all big. They all have flying. That's enough. Whereas, like, it might be much trickier if you were playing a, mono blue Merfolk deck or something. You're like, I can't just rely on hitting people. I have to have a plan to make those creatures stronger or buffer or whatever. But
so kind of similar to your Reki deck then in that aspect, where it's just a bunch of big green, dummies coming at you, but there's more behind it that gives them that oomph to get through.
Yep, I'm going so wide there that the fact that they're not maybe all as scary as the Dromoka creatures kind of is the alternate win condition there.
Yep.
To use another strategy, Aristocrats, for example, where, when a creature dies, Blood Artist does 1 damage to somebody. I don't know if you'd call Blood Artist your win condition necessarily, but in that deck you have 5 different Blood Artist effects you're probably going to have out simultaneously, and trigger that a couple times per turn, and then do that, multiple turns in a row. Your win condition there isn't necessarily 1 card. It's just, generally speaking, you're going to do a bunch of damage to everybody with those kind of Aristocrats effects by sacrificing creatures and killing creatures and stuff. So you have a win condition in a strategy, but it's not one you can kind of point to one specific creature. It's just kind of the non-combat damage version of Max's deck.
The old drain and gain.
Yep, exactly. Your Mogus deck, Chris. That has a similar plan. You're planning on dealing damage to everybody, but you can't really point to one card for the most part, or at least that particular part of your strategy isn't based on one card. It's about, I'm just going to have a bunch of things doing damage to everyone at the same time.
Correct. A lot of times, my goal is to have it where I take less damage than everyone else, but a lot of times it doesn't work out that way. that is the problem. We're all taking equal damage, and I'm just trying to stay afloat.
Yeah, so we're not going to focus on this one too much because it's kind of tough to give you advice on this. Like, either your deck works that way kind of, or it doesn't. Adding 3 Blood Arched effects to your, whatever deck you have isn't going to suddenly make that into a win condition. Your deck kind of has to be built around that. Adding 2 Angels to your, Elf deck isn't going to suddenly make it work like Max's Dromoka deck.
There's green angels? What?
I'm thinking about there's white green angels, I guess, but there's not actually mono green angels that I can think of. So that's a useful thing to think about when you're brewing your deck, but there's nothing we're going to tell you here necessarily today. It's going to be like, oh, this will make my deck better, because your deck either works that way or it doesn't. The second win condition is a combo, basically. Something that generates what's probably an infinite loop. The super easy one to talk about would be Exquisite Blood, which, that's just a life gain effect. That's not, for the most part, going to win you a game. You can't put Exquisite Blood into your deck and be like, okay, now this is going to win me something. But if you combine that with Sanguine Bond, that's an infinite loop. It's just going to kill everybody. Similarly, if you have a way to blink like an Archaeomancer or an Eternal Witness or something to bring back a Time Warp, and you can repeatedly blink it every turn because you have something in play that does that, then while you're not necessarily going to win from doing that, you just take every turn. You just can take, 50 turns, and you will eventually draw removal spells to take out everyone's board state, and you will, worst case scenario, just kill somebody with an Eternal Witness or something. You'll find a better combination of cards than that, but when you can take infinite turns, you're just going to probably find a way to win the game.
Yes.
Again, that probably isn't that useful for us to talk about. There's a gazillion infinite combos out there, and maybe I guess we could suggest one that would be useful in your particular deck, but for the most part, you just are going to have to take a look at what combos are out there and what works in your deck and whatever. So there's just so many, it's a little bit tough to offer advice on. So the third one, I think, is what we are going to focus on here today, and that are cards in your deck that can specifically kind of function as a win condition. The first one I will mention is one that kind of jumps out because there's just not a ton of these in white.
There's one more better than this.
Is there in white?
Yeah, it's called Happily Ever After.
That's true.
Yes, I said it. I dropped it on you.
Yeah, that card. I reluctantly threw that under the 5-color one, but yeah, I mean that's yeah. But Approach is basically a card that if you cast it twice, you win the game. It's just that's what it is. And not every single deck can run Approach if you're playing white. Well, you can run it if you're playing white, I guess, but it's not going to be a great win condition in every deck. But if your deck has a bunch of draw or top deck manipulation or things like that, I wouldn't recommend running it if your plan is to cast it and hope you draw it 7 turns later. You're going to get killed. But there's a lot of decks where I'm going to play this, and I have ways in this deck very easily to dig down 5 or 7 cards into my library and find it again in a turn or two. It's a win condition in those decks. Max's Brago deck that's pretty control-y. I don't know if he still has it in there, but he had it for a while, and that deck drew a ton of cards, had a lot of manipulation, had a lot of control. It was very easy to draw an Approach, cast it, and just be like, okay, you guys run a 3-turn clock because I'm going to hit it at some point in the next 3 turns.
I do love seeing the people play Approach in decks where they're not built around doing it, and they just cast it, and they're just, it's like, well, I cast it, so yeah, that's how this game is going to be played the rest of the time. Now you guys just have to worry, where is it at now in the deck, so...
The reason we're going to focus on this, I think, is because this is the kind of thing where we can talk about a card and talk about Approach, for example, and someone can say, oh, that actually makes sense in my white deck. I'm playing white-blue, there's a ton of draw in here, I got a ton of filtering. I do have a tough time winning. I can just play an Approach and probably draw it pretty easily and win the game. So that's what we're going to kind of focus on, is cards that are universally things that, maybe not work in every deck, but maybe we'll talk about it and you'll realize, oh, this actually makes sense in my deck. The kind of thing we won't talk about or are going to try to avoid, there's an old enchantment called Karma. And during your upkeep, it deals damage to each player equal to the amount of swamps they control. That's a win condition in my Athreos deck, because that deck runs Urborg to make everything into a swamp, and it runs Blanket of Night that makes all lands into swamps, and I have a ton of ways to keep myself from taking damage from specific sources. So I can oftentimes play that and okay, pass a turn, and the next person's like, okay, well, I'm taking 9 damage, and then someone else takes 10, someone else takes 10. Back to me, I take none from it. I'm like, okay, you guys need to kill that Karma now, or everyone's going to die one more trip around the table. But most people's, I almost guarantee you right now, no one listening to this is like, oh, I have the perfect deck for that, because who's running Blanket of,
I can think of a good deck for that, and that would be Campbell.
Sure, maybe, yeah.
If you're playing that Drain Gain type of deck right there.
Sure.
Because you're already in the black-white, so just another Wincon right there.
Yeah, there's definitely decks that can use it, but I'm saying, just generally speaking, the average person might be like, oh, that's really good in my... Because who's running Blanket of Night for the most part, or who's running, the Circle Protection black or white kind of spells that are going to let you dodge the damage yourself.
Circle Protection.
I'm not even running that. I'm running a couple other of those kind of effects in there. But anyway, so we're trying to stick to ones that like you're more likely to hear us talk about it and go, yeah, that actually makes sense in my deck. It's one more way for me to turn that corner to get a win.
Yep.
So white, we'll start with here, and we talked about approach. Are there any particular cards that jump out at you, Chris, as like win conditions in white that you think of? Like, I'm building a white deck, whether it's, mono white or white and green, white, blue, or whatever. Like, this card is a potential win condition in this deck.
So probably the biggest one, and since it's the most recent one, it'll be fresh in people's minds, and that's probably Achroma's Will.
Yeah.
Due to the simple fact of all the modes that it gives you, and when you're playing in white, you're either splashing white into a color, whether it's white red or white green or something like that, or even if you are in mono white, you have all these little creatures that are coming in, and Achroma's Will just makes them pretty much, saying, I am going to become massive and just nuke you out of the board.
Particularly the double strike on there is, and the evasion too. It gives it, stuff flying and protection from colors and whatever. Yeah, if your commander's out and you have creatures that are 2/2s or 3/3s that are suddenly hitting for double strike and they can't be blocked, someone's going to die.
Yeah, I mean, like, out of all of them that are on the list that we have right here, I think Achroma's Will is probably the most versatile of them, and that's why I wanted to mention that one right away, because it can be used as a protection spell at the same time.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, that's it. That card, I can't believe when they printed that, I'm like, that's just like an auto-include in anything running white now.
That shows how bonkers Jessica's Will is, that, like, that's the most, maybe the most powerful of the wills.
Right.
When Achroma's Will is so good, and what's the black one? Zot's Will is really, really good, too. Sakashima's Will is really good, and that's like the fourth best one. That's a great cycle.
Yeah, suck it, Green. You're not good. About
for
time.
once. Yeah, for once, Green got the bad one in the cycle. What are the odds of that? Well, similarly to Achroma's Will, True Conviction, it's trip white, so it's tricky to run sometimes, but like there's decks where True Conviction's a win condition. It's one of the win conditions in my Sphinx Tribal deck. If I've got 3 or 4 creatures out and I drop a True Conviction, someone's getting killed. The same is true in Max's Dromoka deck. Yes. He can, instead of like killing one person with his big beaters that turn, he can kill 2 or 3 people if he has that True Conviction out, and you gain so much life that the other person you didn't kill probably isn't going to be able to kill you next turn.
Yep, and that's the big thing I've been noticing too, going now into our future of Magic, is that people pulled away from the commander damage aspect of the game for a win con. And so, your excessive amount of life just kind of pretty much pads you where no one can take you out then.
Yeah. Although, in the case of Max's Dromoka deck, the double strike from True Conviction puts you on a 2-turn clock, too. So, like, even if he's only hitting you with 1 or 2 creatures, he drops a True Conviction, Dromoka gently taps you for, 12 damage. And you're like, oh.
Gently.
Right. You're like, okay, well, if that happens again, I'm dead. Next turn, I'm just dead to that Dromoka. So sometimes that's enough, too. If your commander's at, like, 6 power or something, that can just get you over the top as well. I mentioned it in our games we played a little bit earlier, but Cathar's Crusade, if you're playing a creature-heavy deck, it's a super annoying card. Like, I've actually pulled it from decks because it's annoying to keep track of the counters and deal with all that. But, like, there's a lot of decks where if you drop a Cathar's Crusade and you've got bodies in play, whatever you follow it up with is going to put so many counters on your stuff, you're going to kill somebody.
Yep, I still play it in my Alesha token deck. And there are a lot of times where I will not cast this card until I can almost guarantee that I'm going to win, because I don't want to do the math.
Yes, for sure. And strategically, that's not a bad idea either sometimes. You don't want to play it just to put 1 or 2 counters on things and have someone remove it when you know if you wait 2 or 3 more turns, you can drop it, and then put 7 counters on things when no one can respond to it at that point, and definitely pull clear for damage. Yeah.
Yes.
2 that I was looking at for a different deck, and actually I DM'd Max this morning. I'm like, are you running these 2 in Dromoka? Are Angel of Destiny and Test of Endurance. And Angel of Destiny is a flying double strike angel, so it fits Max's Dromoka deck. It says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you and that player each gain that much life. So that's the downside here, is when you're hitting somebody, you and somebody else are also gaining life.
Yep.
But at the beginning of your end step, if you have at least 15 or more life in your starting life total, each player Angel of Destiny attacks this turn loses the game. So there's enough times when, who cares if someone else just gained life? Like, if you use that judiciously and Dromoka gains life, he has a bunch of life gain effects in that deck. There's going to be situations where Max drops Dromoka, swings, gains enough life to be over 50 or over 55. Next turn can drop Angel of Destinies, swing at somebody again, and knock them out of the game. Test of Endurance is a similar card. It's an enchantment. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 50 or more life, you win the game. I DM'd him about that one too. I'm like, is that in Dromoka? Because there's just so many games times in that Dromoka deck, he's just at like 70 life or something.
Yep. I've seen that a lot of times out of that deck too.
So if obviously if you're playing like a dedicated life gain deck like Loro or something, that's a great card. But in just doing this show and looking at stuff, I was like, man, that's genuinely a like win condition in a deck like Max's Dromoka deck that isn't even necessarily like a quote unquote life gain deck. It's just a deck that happens to gain a life because his commander gains life and he has a bunch of angels that gain life, and just accidentally that could be a win condition in that deck.
Yeah, I do like that. I mean, even worst case scenario, cards like this, you look at them as like, this could be a win condition. It also turns into a card where it's like you're forcing your opponents to have to deal with it. Because, it's like they either have to block or they have to destroy it, which then sets up for your other win conditions to take over.
I wanted to remove Max's Dromoka, but he just played that Angel of Destiny. I got to deal with that now because that's a much more pressing concern. Yeah, Felidar Sovereign, I guess, is the old example of this. Similarly, where you're at 40 or more life, you win the game. I've not seen a Felidar Sovereign in forever. I think people just like feel bad about playing it because it's kind of an easy win condition.
I had to scryfall it too because I'm like, what does Felidar Sovereign do again?
Yeah,
because I'm like, there's been so many Felidars coming out, and I looked at one, I'm like, oh yeah, that's that one.
The life gain cat, yeah. So that's similarly saying if some decks you're just in a position where I run Felidar Sovereign, or my son has it in his cat deck because it's a cat, and deck doesn't have a ton of life gain, but it does have a bunch of accidental life gain. It's not like a life gain deck, but like there's a handful of different things that gain life in there, including a True Conviction. And like, there's situations where like with that, he's just had Felidar Sovereign out because he's played it as a body, and the next turn drawn in the Chroma's Will, and he killed one person with the Chroma's Will, and then gained enough life that like, that Felidar Sovereign is going to get him a win too. So,
Felidar Sovereign.
Yeah. And talking about cat decks, I guess this is not one that probably goes in every single cat deck, but Lost Leonin is in my son's Arabo deck. That's a 2/1 cat with Infect. But the way Arabo works, Arabo giant grows the creature, so it makes that 2/1 into a 5/4, and the second Arabo ability doubles a creature's power. So it turns that 5/4 into a 10/4, which with an Infect creature kills you. Like that's one card that you can play in a cat deck that Arabo will just buff to the point where it one-shots somebody. But there's also like decks where like there's other, commanders that are like built around buffing creatures, and we'll probably talk about poison and infect in other colors, but like that's something in white. If you have the right deck, Lost Leonin can be a win condition as well.
Oh yeah, I'd get behind that card all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, people forget, infect, they're like, oh my gosh, infect's going to kill me, I can't afford to take the damage. I like Infect for the simple fact of the wither counters that it puts on. It puts on negative counters when something blocks with it. So, I mean, you can take out indestructible creatures and all that fun jazz. So it's like, yeah, I think Infect's really good in Commander if people would play it a little bit better instead of focusing on it as a combo-based win.
Yeah, I think the bad rap that Infect tends to have is maybe Blightsteel, because you just get one shot and get killed. But like if outside of Blightsteel, it's sometimes pretty tricky to win with Infect.
Yes.
So no, I think it's relatively fair for the most part, for sure. The last one I threw out here was near-death experience. If you're somehow able to get yourself to 1 life, you can win. That's not one I see very much. I don't think the average person's going to be like, oh, that's perfect in my deck. It usually shows up in like a Selenia Archangel deck where you can sacrifice a ton of life to Selenia to bounce her. And if you're at the right number, you can be like, oh, I can play near-death experience and sacrifice all my life to 1 and win the game.
Yeah, this would definitely be one that I would not mind losing to if someone pulled this off.
For sure.
There would be pictures taken of the board state and all that, and I'd be like, this was one of the greatest games I've ever played.
Exactly. You earned that win.
Yep.
Any more white ones you want to talk about here, Chris?
Not really. I mean, white's basically known for having your weenies for your combat damage. So, like, these right here show what the other aspects are of in white. And yeah, I mentioned Happily Ever After, but technically it is a 5-color card.
Yeah.
It is only costs you white to cast, and it doesn't actually require you to be playing all 5 colors. But in order for it to work, it has to be in all 5 colors.
And maybe you could count like anthems or something in white as win conditions. If you stack multiple anthems or something, that can be your way to turn that corner and buff your creatures enough to be able to poke through for combat damage. Dictated Heliod is actually, I think, pretty decent for 5 mana. It gives your creatures +2/+2, and it has flash, which is kind of the big deal because you can swing it with some weenies and maybe someone will not block them because they're like, oh, it's only going to be 12 damage. I'm at 26. I can take the 12 and not lose any blockers and be able to crack back next turn. And then you're like, you drop that in as flash, and suddenly that 12 damage, turns into lethal damage. So that's one that might kind of count for that as well.
Yeah, there's the only other things I can think of, and I don't really consider them win conditions. It's more of stay alive conditions. Would be like there's a couple combos like a Solemnity and the other enchantment, Phyrexian Unlife, which prevents you from, you just can't die type of thing. But I mean, it doesn't technically win you the game, but it still could be considered a win con because no one can kill you, so you can just set up until you can win the game.
Exactly. Okay, so should we move on to blue here?
Sure thing.
Blue's also trickier. And actually, it's part of the inspiration for this show to a degree. So I am going to be guesting on the Legendary Creature podcast here in a couple of weeks, and we're talking about blue, just in general. So like early on in the history of their show, and I think we did this too, actually. They did a show just talking about each color, and they want to kind of revisit that after, 4 or 5 years and talk about a particular color and where it's at and just, generally kind of roundtable it.
Yeah, how it's changed over the years type of things.
And one of the things we're doing is everyone's going to brew up a deck, so a mono blue deck of some sort. So I put a blue deck together, and I came up with an idea. Okay, let me try this, something I didn't already have. And then I got fun. I'm like, okay, how do I win the game? And I'm like, ooh, that's much trickier. Because as good as blue is, there's not that many cards that you feel like you can run in your deck that aren't super specific in blue, I think. The first thing that jumps out I will mention is extra turns, and Expropriate is maybe the card that people talk about the most because you can potentially get 3 extra turns out of it. But Expropriate, I guess, as a win condition because you're just going to generate so much value, maybe everyone else can't catch up. And I guess extra turns, if you had, we talked about them under kind of the infinite combo thing, but maybe if you have a plan beyond that, that would count too. Like if you are playing some kind of I'll use my Sphinx deck. I'm not running extra turn cards in there, but Madomi, the Sphinx, does give you an extra turn if you deal combat damage with him. That is kind of a win condition for me in that deck because again, I'm playing beater Sphinxes and getting an extra turn winds up being an extra combat step functionally for me. And that is oftentimes what kills somebody. So yeah, maybe extra turns can count here if you're using them for something like that, like you're treating them like an extra combat step or something. I think that might count as well.
I have one, I think maybe twice with infinite extra turns in a deck. I played it in my mill deck for a while with Mesmeric Orb and the 7 mana extra turn spell. I can't think of the name of it. That was the boxed topper.
Oh yeah,
or whatever. So with Mesmeric Orb, you mill yourself whenever you untap. Everyone does. Well, when that extra turn card goes into the graveyard, it goes back into your deck. Just shuffled in. Well, once the last card in your deck, it just keeps repeatedly getting shuffled back in. You draw it, cast it, play another turn, goes back in, and you can just keep doing that. And if you have any sort of, I was playing mill, so I had other mill outlets out, and then I could just mill the table out.
Not nice.
Yeah, the only way I could do it, I've only done it once or twice, and then I pulled it out because I thought it was really cheeky, and I didn't like winning that way. So.
Sure. Yeah, it gives you the space to do whatever other thing your deck wants to do.
Yes.
I mentioned Sphinxes, so I'll just throw this one out there. A Tempsis is a Sphinx that has a win condition on it. When you deal combat damage, you can reveal your hand, and if you have 6 different mana value cards in your hand, the person loses the game. I run it in my Asteria deck.
To it.
Yeah, I've killed people with it a couple times, and I got killed with it on the EDH Recast stream this week. Elegith Crossroads Augur was a deck I was playing against, which is a mono blue Sphinx partner that if you were to scry, you draw that many cards. Mm-hmm. So Joe just drew 14 cards off some, multiple scry effects and swung at me and hit me. And he's like, okay, here's my hand. You're dead, and again, not every deck probably can do that, but blue draws a ton of cards. Maybe it can. Maybe whatever whatever blue deck you're playing might be able to use it as a win condition. It's one of those things that when you read the card, you're like, what are the odds of that? But the odds are pretty good if you have 14 cards in your hand, and that's not necessarily uncommon in blue.
Yep, and that's another one of those cards that I feel could go into a majority of good blue decks. I mean, unless your deck's highly tuned, just because as a beater and the what if scenario that, I just hit and you look at your hand, you're like, oh, hey, this just actually works out. So here it is. Yeah. That's that one I think is actually a little bit better than maybe people realize it is. Talking about people with flyers, gravitational shift, giving all creatures out flying +2/+0 and all creatures without flying -0 or -2/-0. I wish it was -0/-2.
Yeah,
that'd be awesome.
Amazing. Not only does it shut down your opponent's decks a lot of times, like if you're playing against that person's elf deck and you're like, well, you better have an overrun because your creatures are not dealing damage now.
Yep.
It can turn your creatures, like I run it in my Talran deck and all those 2/2 Drakes hitting for 4, that kills somebody. When I have 6 or 8 Drakes out, people think, okay, I've got a couple turns and I drop Gravitational Shift and someone's dying. So I think in the right deck with evasive creatures, you obviously need to have flyers. That's a win condition, I think, in some decks.
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely a fairer Elesh Norn.
Yeah. So any other ones you want to talk about here, Chris?
Well, we could always, just talk about what Blue's known for winning. I mean, has everyone seen this? If you haven't seen it yet, I feel sorry for the moment that you do see it, because most of the time this type of deck is highly tuned, and that is anything with the Laboratory Maniac effect.
Yeah.
Where they draw their entire deck. If they can't draw any more cards in their deck, they just auto-win the game.
Yep.
So you have your Laboratory Maniac, Jace Wielder of Mysteries, and Thassa's Oracle that all do that. I'm sure there's probably other ones that are like really, fringe type of cards. But those three are the big three that everyone plays, and I've seen them in numerous decks. I've seen people playing them in decks that aren't even meant to do that, but they're just in there as a what-if type of scenario.
There's actually a kid, the son of a friend of mine who's only been playing Magic for a little while, and he started playing Commander. He's actually been coming to the shop last month or so.
Okay.
He built a Merfolk deck. And when I was playing against him at one point, he dropped Thassa's Oracle on turn like 3 or 4, and I'm like, "Oh, do you have a combo here to get to it?" He's like, "What are you talking about?" It's there's a combo. He's like, "I've never even come close to drawing this many cards. Is that something people actually do?" He had no idea. He decides like, "Oh, that's a useful Merfolk. I'll put it in my Merfolk deck."
Yeah, well, that makes sense. I mean, it is a Merfolk, and it has that what if clause stapled on it. So I mean, if you're down that far in the game, you survive that long. I mean, good way to have it.
Yeah, he just was looking at it like, oh, it's a Merfolk. I can scry down a little bit, see some cards. That's pretty useful. Better than like some vanilla Merfolk. I'll put it in my deck. And I just thought that was so funny. He was so innocent to Thassa's Oracle. That was hilarious.
Yeah, and that's the one thing that I dislike about combo wins for like a WinCon, is people who they give these cards bad names, in my opinion. So like a newer kid playing, plays a Thassa's Oracle. And if he's not playing with like people who are, genuinely nice people and, just don't really care, they're here to have fun, immediately you'd get targeted off. Because you see that card and it's like, nope, we know what's going on. You're done right here and right now. And, a kid's innocent and has no clue about that. So
Yeah, right. He could have very easily, if he would have been playing against me, he could have been playing against somebody else. They'd been like, "Oh, Thassa's Oracle, we need to focus you down." He'd be like, "What is happening?"
Yeah, they don't understand. So that's one of the things I don't like about the combo wins in games. Is the fact of people, they just kind of break it off and ruin the game for everybody else.
It definitely can work that way for sure, particularly against a newer player, definitely.
Yep.
Two kind of similar ones here I'll mention. Mechanized Production. If you're in a deck with a ton of tokens or treasures or something, it's a way to win the game if you have 8 or more things of the same name. I mentioned treasures specifically because that's one of those cards where I looked at it before and I'm like, yeah, there's probably some decks that you might make a bunch of copies of something that, would be useful or whatever. But treasures, and particularly in blue, there's a ton of ways to make treasures. I'm like, man, if you're playing in any kind of an artifact deck with emphasis on making treasures, that's oftentimes going to be a card where you can just drop it and like, okay, you guys better figure this out because I'm going to win the game because I have 9 treasures in play right now or something.
Yep, there's definitely... Coming up in the next color, black, there's a key enchantment that just deals with treasures and says I win. So,
and similar to Mechanized Production, Mirrodin Besieged has an option on it. You can choose either to make a 1/1 mirror when an artifact comes into play with it, or the other mode is at the end of your turn, if you have, I think, 15 or more artifacts in your graveyard. And I've killed people, or I've knocked people out with that effect before too, including I think you one time, Chris.
That's been 3 times. Get it right?
Is it okay?
Because every time I sit down and I'm like, oh yeah, I tweaked my mill deck a little bit. This will be good. I'm going to get a win this time.
Against your mill deck, yep.
And then you start playing your blue-black artifacts, and I'm like, oh no, I'm going to lose to Mirrodin Besieged again. This sucks.
Yep, that's right. That's what it was. I forgot about that. There's a relatively new card. I think it was Modern Horizons 2, Triska Decaphile. Beginning of your upkeep, if you have exactly 13 cards in your hand, you win. I've never even seen that in a deck, and that's probably a pretty tough one to hit, but I mean, if you're playing Wizards and you have, ways to draw a ton of cards or something, maybe it's easy enough to get there.
Probably 13. That would be hard.
Exactly 13 too. Yeah. That's way trickier than the one on attempt list to get to.
Yes. That's I would like to see someone try that. That would be very interesting.
The last one I have here in my notes is one it's Corrupted Consciousness, which is an Infect card, and Infect in general we can talk about, but that's really the big one in blue. You gain control of a target creature and it gains Infect. But you can gain control of your own creature. So it's not even, if you can take someone else's creature and give an effect, that's great. But there's been plenty of times I've seen that in decks where someone is playing a deck full of just big beaters and they're like, okay, well, let's see, my turn, I'm going to Corrupted Consciousness my own 12/12 and I'm going to hit somebody.
Yeah. I think the only other thing I can think that blue's really known for, and I talked about a couple times, is the mill aspect of the game.
Yes. Yep.
And it is very hard to play. I don't recommend people try it because I've been trying it for years and I still have yet to perfect it. One of these days I will, but it is a fun thing to try. And if you want to try it once, only try it once. That's all I've got to say about that.
So you talked about black, Chris. We can jump into black, and you can mention the very enchantment you were talking about there.
Yeah, we got an old Revel in Riches. I don't remember the exact wording on Revel in Riches, but I do know it's a 5-mana enchantment. I think you have to have 10 treasures at the beginning of your upkeep to win. Yep, so 10 treasures at the beginning of your upkeep to win, which is actually really, really easy nowadays. I know when Revel first came out, it wasn't quite as easy, but now it's like almost child's play to make that many. So
especially when you have other things that are granting you treasures as well. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, you got I can think of so many things that just I mean, and then with you got a couple, I think that new general or something like that, the black red one, was it Quain or Kane or something like that, creates treasures or something. I don't remember how it worked, but I've seen some people trying that and I'm like, that's cheeky. I like that. I can get behind this.
Prosper makes treasures. There's a couple of them that have some kind of various different forms of treasure interaction that are in black red, or there's what, and it's also one of those cards, like sometimes we talked about Test of Endurance in white as a way to win if you have 50 or more life, but that card doesn't do anything otherwise. So if you don't have 50 more life and you draw that and it's down to turn 12 and you've been getting hammered all game and you're at 14 life, you're like, well, this is dead. I'm never going to get back up to 50 life to win the game. Obviously, you'd ideally not want to draw Revel in Riches when you're at 14 life, but it's not a dead card. If you play it, it's going to generate you treasures, which even if you're not going to get to that 10 win condition point, it's going to generate you treasure that you can use for mana to do other things. So like it does a thing in addition to being a win condition card.
Yes. Create the treasures to cast your favorite card in the world that's in black.
Yep.
Torment of Hailfire.
Yeah, I mean, Torment, and I guess we can lump Exsanguinate in this pile too. They're probably a little bit better in mono black decks that tend to like make big mana from your, Crypt Ghasts and your Gauntlets of, Might or whatever. But Gauntlet of Power, I guess, would be
all that stuff.
But yeah, there's plenty of situations where you can just get to that point in the game where even without those, you're like, oh, I just drew a Torment of Hailfire and I'm going to cast this right now. And everyone's either going to die to it or their board state's going to get so wrecked they just can't bounce back.
Yep.
So like Exsanguinate works the same way. But I would say if you are, there's a lot of mono black decks where you're like, oh, I'm having a tough time winning with this deck because of whatever. You can just put a Torment of Hailfire in and you're going to win. Or it's a win condition on a card, at least. It's going to win you the game sometimes. Yeah,
I know a lot of people that actually have been pulling away from it just because it seems like it's too easy of a win where you can just draw into it at any point in time and just, it is what it is. It's like, okay, I drew into this on turn 12. I have 30 mana I can generate.
Right,
I just drop this and it's like, sorry.
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons I've quit running it, because it never felt like a satisfying win for me, but that doesn't, if someone else out there listening doesn't share, that's fine. I'm nothing wrong with the card. I'm just, for myself, I totally agree. I did it a few times and I'm like, okay, I've done that. It's not fun to do anymore, so I'm just not going to run it. Grave Merchant Asphodel. I mean, coming into play and you've got, particularly in a mono black deck, and you're going to dome everybody for 12 or 14 or something and gain 3 times that amount of life, and then reanimate it and blink it and whatever. That's there's a lot of decks where it's a win condition, but even if you're not planning on doing a bunch of abusive stuff with it, just play in your zombie deck, being able to gain that much life from using it once and hit everyone that hard, there's times in the game that's going to close things out, even if your deck isn't built around looping it.
Yes, that's for sure. I mean, I know people are talking about that new card that's coming out in the new unset or whatever and comboing with that. And I'm like, why do you guys look at these cards? You're not supposed to look at how broken the combo is. Look at how to play it without breaking it.
Right. Yeah. It's because it's pretty easy to break stuff.
It sure is. Speaking of, breaking stuff, you got your Sanguine Bond, Exquisite Blood combo like we were talking about. So, I mean, probably the easiest way of winning, the Scumbags Unite world, that Max is the leader of. That's
Max
what
represent.
They run,
so. But we talked about those two cards, but Sanguine Bond in and of itself is maybe a win condition. Even if you're not someone who wants to run the combo, there's plenty of situations where your commander has life gain or your deck has life gain, and you're like, oh, if I drop that, I'm just going to kill a couple people just because I'm gaining life, because that's how this deck works.
Yep, and mine, I have a reverse aspect in my Mogus deck. I run the Exquisite Blood because I do believe it's whenever they take damage or something like that, you gain the life somewhere. It's like the vice versa of it. So I have the other outlet of that. I don't actually run both of them in mine.
Yeah, that's a good way to turn that, to keep all those damage effects in your deck from hitting you as hard as everybody else because you're gaining more life than anybody else. Infect here is 1/2 in black. There's there's a couple creatures with effect, but Tainted Strike, just if you've got big beater creatures, you can just throw a Tainted Strike, and there's an enchantment, I think Phyresis is one. You can just give a creature effect. If you've got a deck with big beaters, that can just turn it into a one-shot. And I've in a deck with Tainted Strike on at least 2 different occasions, I've cast it on somebody else's creature. When somebody else had a big creature, they were swinging it on somebody, on a third party with, like, okay, I'm going to swing and hit, this person with this 12/12, and I'm like, I'm going to Tainted Strike that. Because, hey, a dead opponent's a dead opponent.
I love that. And then I love the political talk afterwards. It's like, why would you do that?
Exactly,
I didn't do anything to you. And it's like, well, I saw an opening, and I just went for it.
I think if you were somebody who's generally speaking, if you're playing a heavy creature deck, Rise of the Dark Realms can just win games.
Yes, Rise of the Dark Realms, your Living Death, Living End, all of that in general, just such a good... I mean, overall, the ability to reanimate everything is disgusting.
Yeah.
Now, I do believe, isn't Rise of the Dark Realms everybody's graveyard?
It is, and you take them all, yeah.
Yep. Whereas the other 2, Living Death and Living End, are just yours.
Yep.
But still, the aspect, you're coming back to the Gray Merchant aspect, because you can bring them back from the graveyard. Everything triggers at once. You just nuke everyone else. You don't care what they're getting. And I mean, overall, those cards are just Wincons built into themselves, even if you're not comboing it.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because Living Death and Living End require a little more specific deck. But if you're playing black, you can probably run Rise of the Dark Realms and just win games with it sometimes, with just any black deck. One that I've liked a ton lately, it was a card that came out this summer, Vorpal Sword.
Yes, I've died to that actually on Arena, and that was bogus. In draft, I died to that because he played it, and I saw him setting it up, and I'm like, I can't beat this. This is not going to be good.
It's a ton of mana to activate and use, but there are just times when you draw it, and you're like, oh, I have a flyer, and I've got 11 mana. I'm just going to kill somebody.
The worst one is, in the draft format, is that they had the other artifact that gave it unblockable. And then they gave it the Vorpal Sword, and I'm like, run away.
I run it in my Silumgar deck just for the same reason. If I get to that point in the game where I have the mana, Silumgar's hexproof, you better have a counterspell to stop you from casting it, or an instant speed artifact removal spell, or this is going on my hexproof commander, and you're getting domed. And I've gotten a lot of kills with Vorpal Sword.
Yeah. Doesn't it cost, I do believe it costs 3 colorless and 3 black to activate the auto kill, right?
And it's double black to equip and 1 to cast. So I believe it's 11 mana total to do it on 1 turn.
Yep. I mean, it's, very mana intensive. It is, telegraphed. You're going to see it coming, so you have an option to get out of the way of it. But, I mean, I like having options like that in decks that aren't just your auto wins, like a lab man type of win, you know, where when they start doing it, there's nothing you can do about it. Whereas this one, it's telegraphed. As soon as they cast, you're like, okay, I see what's about to happen, and we have to figure something out.
And this one, I think, also is a bit of a Rise of the Dark Realm situation where it's much more open. I do think if you have a flying commander and you're playing black, this is something you can take a look at. It's because your commander can poke through with evasion, or, if you have enough evasive bodies in your deck, whatever, and you're having a tough time finding win conditions, or your win conditions are all combat based, so you're attacking anyway. I do really like Vorpal Sword, so that's one I would definitely recommend as a newer card on this list.
Well, yeah, I mean, +2/+0 and Death Touch. I mean, that just as an equipment, it's pretty good.
Yeah. How about red? What do we have for red that you think of when you talk about win conditions, Chris?
Fireball.
Well, I mean,
the very first thing that pops in my head is always Fireball, because I remember when I first started playing Magic, we used to play kitchen table. It was me and a couple buddies during my early high school years, and I had one of them who was playing a red-green elf deck with Priest of Titania, all that stuff, and it was just like, oh, you're making all this mana, that's cool, you couldn't figure out how they were going to kill you, all of a sudden they're like, Fireball. And it's and then I can chain it, by paying an additional red to bounce it over to here and bounce it over to here, and I'm like, oh, okay, I see. This is pretty cool. So that's usually the first thing I think of when I think of red, is your instant, or not instant, but your direct spell damage type of cards.
And there's ones that do damage to everything. There's earthquake type effects too that are like the X spell that deals damage to all creatures and players or something.
Yes.
Now, you probably ideally want to have a way to dodge some of that damage, but Maybe you have a life gain deck. Maybe you're playing some kind of red-black deck with a bunch of life gain, or you have a red-white deck with a bunch of protection spells or something.
Circle of protection.
Yeah,
again.
there you go. Yeah, I mean, I think that the Bonfire and Sunday, Fire Song and Sunspeaker deck, I think runs Earthquake kind of effects for that reason. So yeah, I mean, there's decks where that's a way to just win the game. I think the best example of this is probably Chandra's Ignition.
Yes,
because it doesn't hit you. And yes, it's a board wipe, and it's a great board wipe, but also like there's decks where, hey, you routinely make 20 power creatures for whatever reason, whether it's a +1 counters deck or a mutate deck or something. There's just a lot of decks that work that way where you have those giant bodies in play pretty frequently. Chandra's Ignition just kills everybody. Yep. Or Infect, like if you're playing some kind of a black-red Infect deck and you've got a bunch of creatures with Infect, and that creature can get big enough, you can just kill everybody with Infect damage then. Like there's a bunch of situations where Chandra's Ignition just kills people.
Yes. And I mean, well, with Chandra's Ignition too, I mean, you don't have to have a big creature if you're in red, because you have all the damage doublers.
Yeah,
so
you
have your enchantments that do that. I think there's a couple spells that do it too, that double it. Maybe there's a Planeswalker too. I don't even know. There's just so many of them floating around there of outlets to be able to do that. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be a massive creature.
Yeah, I mean, Gratuitous Violence and the new one, Fiery Emancipation, that triples the damage jump out. Yeah, those are ridiculous. You can talk about doubling things, like there's a bunch of, we talked about True Conviction for white, but like red has their versions of that. They have Berserker's Onslaught and Rage Reflection that give all your creatures double strike. And if you're playing some kind of a deck where you can poke through, that's also a kind of a win condition in those situations. Temur Battle Rage. I have died to Temur Battle Rage a bunch of times on a creature.
I have died to it a lot in Modern. Never in Commander, but in Modern I have.
There's a few other downloads. You mentioned the spells, Chris. There's things like Unleash Fury and Fatal Frenzy that are kind of reds. They'll double a creature's damage or double damage to end a turn. There's creatures like Fiendish Duo that double the damage being dealt. So there's a handful of red spells that do things like that as well. That, I mean, in your deck, absolutely look at those kind of things. I think those really stand out for me. Like there's a lot of decks where you're like, oh man, that if I can run that giving my creature double strike, I can kill people in a way I couldn't otherwise do it. Fire Emancipation, same thing. Like those really stand out. Extra combat steps. We talked about like extra turns as a way to get extra combat steps. But like red, that's one of red's strengths is extra combat steps. And there's a lot of situations where that absolutely is a win condition.
Yes.
And we talked about Rise of the Dark Realms. Insurrection, I guess, would be the creatures in play version of that. Man, this card used to burn me years ago because I had a couple friends that played it regularly, and I'm like, oh, would be so frustrating.
I haven't seen an Insurrection in years.
I haven't either at this point.
I think it's just because there are just better cards overall now, and people are starting to see aspects of the decks and how to make, like your better Wincons in it instead of having, like, oh, I just need to rely on this to do it. Now, I do think the Insurrection is still a very good card, and people should play it if it's in your wheelhouse of that type of deck. I wouldn't just jam it willy-nilly in anything.
I wonder if it's one of those cards where people play it, and then like after using it a couple times to win with, they're like, okay, well, I'm kind of bored of this now, so I'm taking it out.
Yes. That's kind of, there's a green one that I played like that too, where you flip the top card of your deck until you hit a spell or something like that.
Primal Surge?
I think I did it twice, and I'm like, yeah, this is not fun anymore.
I had it in my Sigarda deck for the same reason, because I only had a couple instant sorceries, and I'd like, for the first couple times I cast it, I'm like, oh, I put 40 permanents into play, and that was fun, but I'm like, okay, I've done it. I'm good now.
Yep. I know the last one in red that we have on here is Hellkite Tyrant.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think, I think every single deck has had, or every single color's had one of these, but Hellkite Tyrant is another one of those alt just straight up wins.
Yeah.
And it reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 20 or more artifacts, you win the game. But it also reads whenever it deals combat damage to a player, gain control of all artifacts that player controls. So it allows you to actually steal artifacts to gain that incremental advantage to win the game by the alt win condition.
Yeah, and I think to hit the alt win condition, you probably need to be playing some kind of artifact deck yourself. But like just as a value creature, taking everyone's artifacts is insane. And the fact that like maybe you will get lucky and you'll be playing that person who's playing that my Vela deck, for example, and you're going to hit me and like take 16 different things, and you're like, and you already happen to have a couple artifacts out, and you're like, okay, I'm going to win. Like it's a really useful creature that also is going to sometimes win you games.
Yep, I think the only time I've ever played it, I got it out and I looked around the board at who to attack with it, and I'm like, okay, well, you have 3 artifacts. I'm never going to get the 20, but you have the most artifacts. I'm just going to steal all yours.
Yeah, I'm going to take your Soul Ring and your Thran Dynamo and your Arcane Signet, and then my next turn's going to be crazy.
Yep, and I'm going to draw, my 1 card in red and only have 1 card in hand and be like, yeah, that was a waste.
Right, yeah. So we might as well move down to green here. And the first thing in green to talk about is just kind of the obvious one, which is overrun effects, which is kind of a catch-all you use for all creatures you control get, plus whatever till end of turn and trample. And there's a bunch of different variants on this. There's overrun, there's overwhelming stampede, there's, Craterhoof Behemoth does it, Pathbreaker Ibex does it. A couple of different Garruk Planeswalkers have abilities that do it. Landfall trigger things that you can do where creatures get, +1/+1 and trample for each land you play. Return of the Wild Speaker buffs all your I think it's non-human creatures +3/+3. There's just a bunch of different versions of this. And green tends to be playing decks that play creatures. I don't know if anyone out there is listening is like, I didn't think of putting an overrun in my creature deck. I think most people do that. But it's a Wink edition, right? And maybe just because you have one or two of them doesn't mean your deck wouldn't benefit from having a couple more or two.
Yeah, every time I think of overruns, I think of the Avatar movie. Towards the end of the movie when they're all sitting there and the soldiers are walking through the forest and all of a sudden here comes the stampede of these giant rhino things, and I'm like, that's an overrun there. You're done.
Somebody cast overrun. You're getting Any other ones in green that you think about, Chris?
The biggest thing I think about in green is your combat damage step. Just because green is known for its creatures. So any of your pump spells, like you talked about overruns, but you got all the other ones such as giant growths or your berserks. What's the other one you got on here? Choose your weapon, which that's the new one from AFR, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. That doubles a creature's power till end of turn.
Yep. That kind of stuff. Your Nylea's Colossus or Ancestral Mask, which give pumps if you're, an Enchantress types builds. That kind of stuff, that's what I think of when I think of green. But probably the biggest card in green that everyone probably thinks of that's like, oh, that card's a win con is Doubling Season.
Yeah.
By far, Doubling Season hits the board and everyone knows what that card is. And immediately it's either we have to remove it or we have to kill that player or just pray to the Lord that they don't actually have something to break this card.
We also just got Unnatural Growth fairly recently. I think that was also an AFR. At the beginning of each combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn.
Yes, that's each combat. Remember, each combat.
I'm glad you pointed that out, for sure. So if you have someone to do extra combat steps, that's insane. I mean, it's insane as it is. It probably kills people just doubling it once. But the ability to use that in conjunction with an extra combat step is nuts.
I actually got somebody in Standard with that card where I played it. I couldn't attack them that turn, like a good logistical attack. And they turned and I was at 6 life or something like that. And they're like, okay, I'm going to attack you. And I'm like, okay, I block with my guys who are double in power and toughness right now. And they're like, oh, nice. I'm like, yeah, it says each combat. And they're like, oh, I did not read that far into that one.
I had tinkered for a while. I never wound up building it. It was a Samut deck. So she's a Naya and haste and double strike. And I was thinking about building a Naya double strike deck and then running extra combats in it as well. So all your stuff would hit for double strike, doing second combats. I'm like, man, if I could, it's 4 green mana to run a Natural Growth, but then they double in damage during the extra combats for doing double strike damage. Oh, it's so many doubling. That would be amazing.
No, that math would be horrible. I don't know what you're talking about.
It would also be unnecessary because you're like, okay, yeah, you hit me for 700. That's fine. You killed me.
No, I'm not done yet. I got to get a new record.
Yeah, do it one more time. Yeah. Epic Struggle is one that I've not seen in a few years, but beginning of your upkeep, if you control 20 more creatures, you win. I think the problem there is probably if you control 20 more creatures during your upkeep, you're probably going to win anyway.
Yeah, I think this would be a nice inclusion in tokens decks.
Yeah.
I actually haven't really seen it in any tokens decks, but I think it would be a good inclusion just for the simple fact of sometimes you just have your little 1/1 tokens, but you can't do anything with them. You're looking for your anthems, you're looking for your sack outlets if you're running, an aristocrat type build with it. But if you had this out, then it's just an additional win con to put out.
Exactly. Triumph of the Hordes probably counts as an overrun, but we'll also mention Triumph and Infect. There's Infect stuff in green as well. Triumph probably the easiest one, but that's, a way if your deck is having trouble turning that corner, maybe Triumph will put you over the top.
Yes, that's for sure. I do love this last one you have on here, though. I saw this one once, and that was actually the friend of the show, Luke Witten, played this, I do believe, in his deck, and that was Helix Pinnacle.
Yeah, that's such a good card.
Would you have to have 100 counters on it or something to win the game? It's a 2-mana enchantment that you can just keep putting counters onto it with X amount of mana. I don't remember how much mana it cost to activate it. But yeah, at the beginning of your end step or beginning of your upkeep, if you had 100 more counters, you just win the game. And it's amusing to watch people. They're like, I'm just going to put some counters on here. And eventually you forget about it until it's like, how many counters are on there? Oh, 93? Oh, no.
Yep. Yeah, and it's got shrouds, so no one can really interact with it either. It just sits there unless you have some kind of an enchantment sweeper. It's just, you're like, okay, we're all on a clock. Let's figure it out.
It is an interesting card for sure.
And that's one of those cards probably works best in a certain kind of deck that's built around it, but it's also one where you're like, oh, I'm playing some kind of a control list with green, and I do tend to make a lot of mana because green makes a lot of mana. If it is a card you can put in there and you're like, oh, okay, there's times I'm going to get to turn 8 or 9 or something, and I've got 4 counter spells in hand and a couple fogs, like, oh, I can just ride it out. I can win the game with this in 3 or 4 turns just by, hanging back and making sure no one else wins the game.
Yep.
There's a bunch of ones in multicolor that are like mostly alt-weighted condition things like Simic Ascendancy or Maya's Ariel or Sire of Insanity kind of is one because you knock someone down to 1 life. Door to Nothingness. We mentioned Halfway Ever After. There's Maze's End, I guess, which is on a land, but the last one I think we'll talk about in a little more details, maybe artifacts, because there are a few interesting artifact ones. And what's nice about these is they can get plugged into any deck. And I will just mention, again, in fact, if you have a commander that's beefy, Grafted Exoskeleton gives your commander gives whatever creature it's on +2/+2. And in fact, there are situations where like your commander is going to kill somebody if you have a Grafted Exoskeleton out.
Yes, I've seen that numerous times. Mm-hmm. Or it's like Grafted Exoskeleton hits and you're like, oh, that's not too bad. And then they equip it and you're like, wait. And you start doing the math and you're like, oh, that's very, very bad.
In my first iteration of my Jury deck, I had it in there because I'm like, oh, I can, Jury does X amount of damage to somebody when he dies. And if I have Grafted Exoskeleton, I just kill somebody. What I found was the way the deck worked was if I was able to get to the point where I could put 10 counters on Jury to kill someone with Grafted Exoskeleton, I could put enough counters on Jury that it didn't matter. So the way the deck worked, if I got to that point in the game, if I could make him in 10, I could make him into a 20 or a 26 or something and kill somebody anyway. So I wound up taking it out and putting more things that sped up that process into the deck. But there's decks where that works too. Like if your commander is something that can deal damage directly to people, Grafted Exoskeleton works really good too.
Yes. I gotta say probably, like the biggest one on this list that probably everyone's going to know is Aetherflux Reservoir. Just dome someone for 50. Costs you 50, but it is what it is. Exactly. Most people are playing this are just like, oh, I'm at like 100 life, so yeah, we'll just dome you for 50 and then sit here and look at the other player and be like, all right, what's up? Who's going to make the first move?
Take the shot, boys. Yep, exactly. Well, talking about, Darksteel Reactor, indestructible artifact for 4. At the beginning of your upkeep, you can put a charge counter on it, and if it has 20 or more charge counter on it, you win the game. So you're probably not running that in your deck just blindly, but like if you're playing a deck that's, has ways to put counters on things or double counters.
Proliferate.
That's the way to do that. You can just, put that on there and okay, well, I'm going to use these proliferate effects or counter doubling effects for other things, but maybe I'll drop Darksteel Reactor at the right point in the game and 3 turns later be able to roll it up to 20. That's just going to happen.
I'm very surprised I haven't seen this in any of those Atraxa decks. Most of the time when I see Atraxa come out, it's all Planeswalkers, and honestly, I'm going to start recommending this card to people and be like, yeah, so you want proliferate effects. How about you put this in here as a good proliferate target?
It's really tough to remove, too.
Yep,
that's what I like in the right deck. And if your deck fits that description, that can maybe be a win. Equipments. There's some equipments we mentioned, I guess, Grafted Exoskeleton has in fact, but it's also an equipment that can turn a creature into a one-shot. The other one that jumps out here for me is Blackblade Reforged. I mean, it kills people sometimes. I have been
smacked with that by Max numerous
Exactly.
times.
That's a perfect example. Like his deck, it's not an equipment deck. He's not doing anything special in that deck, except for there are times he just drops Blackblade Reforged and kills you. Because Dromoka's a big body. He has evasion.
30 lands out.
Right, exactly. Like someone else has ramped out a few lands and you've got to that point in the game where it's just suddenly, oh, my creature gets +14/+14, you're dead. So if your deck is one of those, I think that's the kind of card where you're like, oh, I have this Angel Tribalist in mono white or something, and I really have a tough time turning the corner sometimes. Blackblade Reforged is the kind of card that can do that. Like, oh, I'm just going to put it on this commander and kill somebody. Any other artifact ones that kind of jump out at you and talk about, Chris?
So I was thinking about this, and the other thing that I came to was combining artifacts with other colors. And a big one that popped in my mind was cards such as like the Rack or anything that, because black plays a lot of like discard outlets. Black's just known for having people discard cards, out of their hand, so that you can keep hands underneath control to deal damage off of the Rack, or I'm sure there's other ones. That's just the one that popped in my head at the time. So that was one that I was thinking about for artifacts mainly. Anything else for you?
There's a couple small ones, like, so Psychosis Crawler. deals damage whenever you draw a card.
Yes.
But there are some decks that you just draw a ton of cards. Where I've most recently seen it is Matt Morgan on the EDH Recast has a Riel the Everwise deck. And Riel says whenever you discard one or more cards for the first time each turn, you draw that many cards. So he's a ton of looting effects in there, and there's wheel effects in there. If you have a Psychosis Crawler out and he wheels, that's not good.
Oh, no.
You're gonna die.
Oh, no.
So there are some decks that are built around Psychosis Crawler, but like there are some situations where you're like, oh, my deck accidentally works really well with Psychosis Crawler, and that's one of them.
Yes.
So that's the kind of thing I think jumps out. There's a relatively Strixhaven Stadium from Strixhaven. If you're playing some kind of a weenie deck, you can rack it up to 10 counters and kill somebody pretty easily. I've seen that do a lot of work as well. So that's one I like a lot, and think there's that can see a home in a lot more decks than maybe people realize also.
Yeah, definitely. Now I know Door to Nothingness is technically a 5-color card, but it is an artifact, and I have seen the door. Our store owner likes to play it in his 5-color deck, and he looks at me, he's like, I'm going to show you the door again. And I'm like, okay, bring it. And then he shows me the door, and there's nothing I can do about it. It's just like, yeah, that it is what it is. Okay, bye.
One last one I'll mention here that I like, that I think can easily slot into a lot of spell slinger-ish decks is Sentinel Tower that was in Battle Bond, I believe. It's a 4-mana artifact. Whenever an instant or sorcery spell is cast during your turn, Sentinel Tower deals 1 damage to any target equal to 1 plus the number of instant or sorcery spells cast before that spell this turn. So you basically on your turn, if you're like playing the kind of deck that's like casting 3 or 4 spells pretty easily, that just magically deals 10 or 12 damage to somebody, or takes on multiple blockers or whatever. And I think that's the kind of thing where you're like, oh, I'm playing this Kess deck, and the only way I can win is if I get to some infinite combo, and I wish that wasn't the only way I had to win. Try Sentinel Tower. Like there's decks where that's just going to generate enough generic damage to people over the course of you doing what you want to do that it's worth considering as a win condition. And I guess on a similar note, Throne of the God Pharaoh, where it deals damage for each tapped creature at the end of your turn. There's token decks where the same thing happens. Like you're playing a token deck and your plan is to swarm people. That's great, but like why not get some extra power out of that? Okay, I swarmed and killed one person with 12 creatures this turn, and I guess I could kill the next person when I untap, or they could just take a bunch of damage from Throne of the God Pharaoh at the end of your turn versus waiting a full turn.
Yeah, I have seen Throne hit the table and you just want to cry when it comes out.
Yeah, I can't do anything about this. Yeah.
Yep.
So those are ones for me. So yeah, I think that will wrap up this show, I believe. I think there's a lot of useful ones here, and this was something, like I said, on my mind because I was trying to find Wincons for a particular deck. So hopefully something we threw out there winds up being useful for your deck. And if there's anything we missed that you're like, oh, this is really good in red decks, because of X, Y, and Z or whatever, as a win condition, let us know. That's always useful because, we are also looking for ways to sometimes tweak those decks that just don't have ways to win and find ways to turn those corners. All right. I am Dana. You can find me on the Twitterbirds at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max, and you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show is edited by Rafael Garcia. You can find them on the Twitterbirds at Ursa Bearwalker. And our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We will be back next week. Until then, I'm Dana.
And I'm Chris.